Thank you, Rabbi Schulman, for inviting me to speak today, and thank you all for joining this video message on Yom Kippur 2020. I hope you and your loved ones are healthy and practicing appropriate social distancing. If 78 years ago someone had told me I would be talking on a thin box called an iPad, you see, I wrote it like that, on something called Zoom on Yom Kippur in 2020 to a congregation in San Diego, I would have thought that they were delirious, as so many of my patients were during the dark times. But God had blessed me with a long life and winding road of a joyous childhood. Several tragedies, a wonderful large family, many friends, and huge personal fulfillment. And today, an opportunity to remind you of our obligation as Jews, only to never forget our past and the gratitude we all should have for what the Almighty has provided for us now and will provide for us in the future. If you will indulge me for just a moment, I'd like to say a few words about the role that Congregation Beis El continues to play in my life. I've been a member since arriving in San Diego from South Africa in 1979. Some of my closest friends are fellow members and have provided me with solace during the difficult times and shared my joy during good times. And the rabbis over the years have been kind, generous with their time, and spiritually important to me. And during this coronavirus period of isolation, the webcasts from the shul have provided me with context, and community. Thank you, Rabbi Schulman and Rabbi Avi, for all you do for us. I, along with other Holocaust survivors, have experienced discrimination, hatred, and witnessed unspeakable horrors. After decades of silence, mainly to protect my family from pain so that they could live a normal life, I began telling my story in the late mid-1980s. With the intent that the world should never forget, and the hope that these atrocities will never again be inflicted on the Jewish people. I went so far as to write a book chronicling my experience as a historic record of what can happen when discrimination goes unchecked by the world. These lessons are as relevant today as they were when 1/3 of the Jewish people on earth were wiped out during the Second World War. The senseless murder at Chabad of Pave of my fellow Hadassah member, Lori Kay of blessed memory, merely because she and other victims were Jewish, torments me. Our response to this and other atrocities, despite our rage, must be love, outreach, and education, and building on our faith, community, our hope for a better future. I despise all forms of anti-Semitism, racism, hatred, and inequity. I'm upset by the act of cruelty we have seen on television. I'm disheartened by the violence that has ensued, but I'm encouraged by those who peacefully speak out against discrimination, particularly institutionalized discrimination, which needs to be addressed in our society, because otherwise the unthinkable results of such discrimination are only delayed and not eliminated. We should all continue to work towards a more just world. I want to say a few words about the book, my memoirs, and then describe one of the many stories that make up my life's experience. This is a story of my little sister, one of the 1.5 million Jewish children killed in the Holocaust. Regarding the book, I've been through a lot of difficult experiences, tragedies really, and I've been blessed to have had many wonderful times and view myself as very, very fortunate to have had the full life God has given me. But I must tell you, writing this book was very difficult. It was draining. Recalling certain events gave me sleepless nights. Divulging certain secrets that I have held for 70 years was traumatic. So why did I do it? At the World Assembly to commemorate 40 years since the defeat of Nazi Germany and its satellites, in May of 1985 in Israel, 1,500 survivors, including myself, vowed to share our stories of the Holocaust as broadly as possible. I decided it was time to tell my story. I gave many lectures and made some notes emphasizing my mission to ensure that the hate that brought about the Holocaust and the attempted destruction of the Jewish people should never happen again. For years since then, I thought it would be useful to write down my story for my family and for their future generations. But it was my good friend Selwyn who convinced me that my story had many important messages that need to be documented, understood, and read by everyone interested in the horrors that can befall any of us when evil prevails, and the ability we all have to rebuild a meaningful life. We all do it differently. So the book describes the story and lessons I learned in trying to build a normal life. My story, which began in my hometown of Libau in Latvia, is one of many, many miracles. It's one of hope, it's one of innate values that I was taught by my parents. It's one of belief, optimism, and joy. Love of Israel, the Hadassah organization, and most importantly, my family. I hope that by writing this book, I impart to you and others my memories, my miracles, and my perception of its meaning, learned over almost a century ago. I lost 79 of 81 family members. Less than 1.25% of Latvian Jews survived the Holocaust. Not only did I witness many atrocities, but I lost my little sister Libele because she was born Jewish and was too young to be of use to the Nazi killing machine. My parents, Sarah and Herman Yudelovich, had 3 daughters. I was the oldest. My sister Jenny was 2.5 years younger than me, and Liebele was 12 years younger than I was. She was about 4 or 5 when I left Libau to attend university in Riga, where I eventually studied nursing. Liebele was incredibly cute, very Aryan-looking, with blonde hair and blue eyes. We treated her as if she was a doll. My mother doted on her, while Jenny and I played with her as kids. We all adored her. We had a close family. We were not very religious, but we always celebrated Shabbat dinners, my mother organizing a wonderful dinner following by her playing the piano, while my father, who was my hero, danced with me while I stood on his shoes, and the family and guests sang along and generally had a good time. That all changed when in July 1941, within days of the Germans defeating the local Russian garrison, who had occupied our town a year earlier, the Nazis gathered the men of working age and took my father and over 1,000 Jewish men to what we believed was a work camp. This was the last time I saw my father, who I just adored. We later found out that the men were actually marched to the Baltic shore near the lighthouse, made to dig mass graves, and shot. There were several human cullings, exercises by the Germans and local militia over the next few months. They called them selections, where groups of Jews were made to stand in a line, and those that were useful to the Nazis were sent to the left, and the others to the right, and to their death. There were selections of more males for execution, and also for infirm Jews and older Jews. But then, on December the 15th, in 1941, the first day of Hanukkah, the festival of lights, the holiday of freedom, thousands of women, children, and remaining men were made to stand in line for selection at the women's prison, including my mother, sisters, uncles, aunts, and cousins. After the selection, almost 3,000 Jews, fellow Jews, were taken to the Shkedi beach and shot. In the book, I describe how by a miracle I was able to assist my sisters and mother escape this murder frenzy, but had to leave behind all my other relatives. Eventually, when there were only 800 of the 9,000 Jewish inhabitants of Libau left, including only 175 males, we were forced to move into the Libau ghetto, an area of just 4 blocks with 11 homes surrounded by barbed wire. Each room was shared by multiple families. During the day, Liebele played in the kindergarten with the other little children whose mothers were working as forced laborers for the Germans. I spent long hours at the tiny ghetto infirmary. My mother worked as a seamstress, and my sister Jenny chopped bricks for the restoration of the buildings the Germans had demolished in their attack on Libau. Then again, on Friday, October 8th, 1943, at 4 a.m., we Jews were ordered together in the ghetto courtyard. My mother, my sisters, and I, and all the others in the ghettos were told that we were to be transported to the Riga concentration camp. Kaiserwald was the name of it. But who could trust what we were told by our captors? And we gathered in great trepidation, despondency, and despair, thinking we were transported to our death, like so many others we now know of. We were marched to the cattle cars in which we spent the next 24 hours like sardines, with no food, water, ablution facilities. When we reached the Kaiserwald camp, the men were separated from the women in the yard outside the barracks. First, the men were sorted into lines. Those that could be useful in one line, and the others identified for death in the other line. Those men that were to remain alive were forced to jog to their barracks, and the others marched off to their death. It was extremely cold in the yard, and the children were hungry and crying. Eventually, the women and children were sorted into two lines. Again, those who were able to work were directed to stand in one line, while the smaller children, the weaker, the elderly, and the sick were ordered to the other line. My baby sister, Liebele, who was just 8 years old, was sent to another line by herself. Of no value to our captors, those in the other line were likely headed to certain death. My mother, who was in our line, took my hand and my sister Jenny's hand and asked me to take care of Jenny. Despite our desperate crying and begging and hanging onto her with all our remaining energy, my mother, following her maternal instincts, pulled away and said that she could not leave her 8-year-old daughter alone. I need to go with her, my mother said, struggling out of grasp. I can't let my little Liebele go by herself. So you too can look after yourselves. Fanny, look after Jenny, she commanded. My mother then ran to join Liebele in the other line. Mother, where are you going? Screamed Jenny. It was one of the bravest and most courageous acts I've ever witnessed. My mother always put others first, and this was in keeping with her character. She couldn't bear to see her 8-year-old daughter face death on her own. And at the same time, she was signing her own death warrant and essentially appointing me to assume her role as guardian of my younger sister. There isn't a day that I don't think about my mother's selfless act. The trucks took my mother and my baby sister to the Riga ghetto. They perished together on November 2nd in 1943, when the Riga ghetto was liquidated after its inhabitants were marched 12 miles to the Rumbulla forest and shot. At least this is what I believed for 75 years. In researching this book, we reached out and communicated with several historians, scored records and searched books, including one by someone who escaped from my mother's Kaiserwald selection group. And she said in her book, heart-rendering scenes took place, Riva Zivson wrote. I saw Mrs. Sarah Yudelovich say goodbye to her two older daughters as the SS-men with rifles loaded the unwanted women and their children onto trucks to knows what fate. The historians have pieced together the facts that the trucks actually transported the non-useful women and their children to the Riga ghetto. In the ghetto, the women were sent to work and the children were looked after by the older women for about a month until the selection on November the 2nd in 1943. Those selected were mainly children under 12 years old and those mothers who wanted to stay with their children. They were herded onto a transport and all were gassed within hours of the train arriving in Auschwitz, and they were never registered as camp inmates. Separate sources report that the November 2nd train to Auschwitz carried passengers from the Libau ghetto that had arrived in Kaiserwald on October the 8th. So now I believe that there is a high possibility that my dear mother and baby sister were murdered at Auschwitz on either November 2nd or 3rd in 1943. And this year I said Kaddish and lit candles on both dates. I cannot put into words the pain I now feel with the reopening of this wound. May their soul rest in peace together. In my book, I describe how more than 70 years after her cruel death, my sweet, sweet little Liebele, Bar Mitzvah, was celebrated in Atlanta, Georgia, in the land of the free and the home of the brave. I weighed 59 pounds and suffered from typhus when I was liberated on May 5th in 1945. I had nothing, not even dirty clothing. I was wrapped in a sheet. After being in a quarantine hospital in Kiel, Germany, I was moved while in and out of comas by ambulance to a recovery hospital in Schafstedt, where through another miracle, I recovered sufficiently to be transported to the British Army Field Recuperation Hospital in Itzehoe, Germany. There I started my struggle back to being human again. Because of my nursing background and the fact that I spoke several languages, I was requested to start work at UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, in their medical services operation. And there were many days when I would work in Hamburg during the day and return to the hospital in the evening. Through another miracle described in the book, my sister Jenny and I were placed on a transport from Lübeck, Germany, to Landskrona, Sweden, where we were again quarantined. Then, through an incredible coincidence, and we Jews don't believe in coincidences. I was offered an interview in Stockholm at the World Jewish Congress. As an employee of the World Jewish Congress in Stockholm, I was part of the lobbying effort for the United Nations to approve a country that Jews could live in peacefully. I was lucky enough to meet many of the founders of Israel and witness the passing of United Nations Resolution 181 in November 1947, and then celebrate the proclamation by David Ben-Gurion establishing the State of Israel on May 14th in 1948. I beg you never to forget, wherever you might be, whatever your condition, whatever your success or challenges you have, and whatever your political bias or religious commitments might be, Israel is your last defense, and it needs to be protected, supported, and cherished. I know what it was like not to have a Jewish state. In this current environment of hate of all kinds, including the re-emergence of anti-Semitism, often disguised as anti-Israel rhetoric, it is up to each and every one of us to do deeds of kindness for all, to fight hate and encourage love amongst all, but also to take care of our less fortunate Jewish brethren and to educate people about Israel, its history, its people, and its achievements. After all, it's our destiny and our obligation to be a light unto all nations. At the end of 1948, I traveled to South Africa, where I married Louis Krasner, my Betar consular in Libau. And God blessed me with 3 wonderful children. A few years after Louis' untimely, actually I was married 31 years to Louis. And a few years after Louis' untimely death, I was blessed again when I met and married Morris Lebovits, a United States Navy commander and aeronautics engineer who passed away in 1996. Morris' son Mark became my 4th child, and together my children have given me 9 grandchildren and 13 great-grandchildren. Most of my family live in Southern California. They are all devoted to Israel and our family and to their Jewish heritage. And this is my personal victory over Hitler at the age of 97, perhaps my final miracle. Each year on Rosh Hashanah, when we chant Sunatev Tekef, I seem to sob very hard when we get to the words on Rosh Hashanah. On Rosh Hashanah it is inscribed, and on Yom Kippur it's sealed, and how many shall pass and how many shall be born? Who shall live and who shall die, and who shall reach the end of the days and who shall not? My mind rushes to my deceased husbands, my parents, my dearest little sister Liebele, the 79 members of my family who perished in the Holocaust, those others whom I witnessed die and disappear, and the millions who were killed at the hands of the Nazis, merely because of their faith. I also recall my friends and family who have since passed on, and I wonder about my own mortality and the year ahead. Our text and commentaries describe how the light is hidden in the darkness. Though I sit in darkness, the Lord is a light unto me. Had I never sat in the darkness, I would have never have seen the light. So darkness is the source of light. Let us go on living with shared commitments to remember the past, to live the present, and to trust the future. Thank you again for your interest and for listening today. Shana Tova, may all of you enjoy a fruitful and meaningful new year filled with kindness, good health, and lots of love.